Dearest friends, this is the 6th session in our series on the life and work of Abdu'l Bahá, and we shall cover the Master's second visit to Europe, the war years, and the tablets of the Divine Plan. The White Star liner, the SS Celtic, carrying Abdu'l Bahá from America to England, docked at Liverpool on Friday, December 13th, 1912. Hippolyte Dreyfus Bonney, the husband of Laura Bonney, who had compiled some answered questions, you remember, Elizabeth Herrick and Isabel Fraser of London, Mr. E.T. Hall and John Craven of Manchester, John Downes of Leeds, and Abdu'l Bahá's son-in-law, Aga Ahmad Yazdi, were at the quayside. The members of his retinue who had crossed the Atlantic with him were Mirza Mahmoudi Zagani, Sayyid Asadullah Ikumi, and Mirza Ahmed Sohrab. Abdu'l Bahá stayed for 3 nights at Liverpool at the Adelphi Hotel. He addressed the Liverpool Theosophical Society, and on the Sunday he spoke from the pulpit of the Pembroke Chapel. And he left for London on Monday, December 16th. Lady Blomfield had moved out of her flat at 97 Cadogan Gardens to make it available for Abdu'l Bahá. And once again there was a stream of visitors at all hours of the day and into the night. One day 2 ladies arrived from Scotland who had planned to take the night train back, and Lady Blomfield had made sure that they would have an hour or so alone with the Master without interruption. Then a journalist arrived. He was looking for a story, and he wanted a few telling points. So he sat down, crossed his legs, lighted a cigarette unasked, and kept up a barrage of questions. Lady Blomfield and the ladies from Scotland were shocked. After a very short time, Abdu'l Bahá got up, beckoned the cheeky man to follow him, and went to another room. Lady Blomfield later wrote, "We looked at one another. The bore had gone, but so, alas, had the Master." Some time passed, then Lady Blomfield sent a message by one of the attendants of Abdu'l Bahá. "Will you kindly say to Abdu'l Bahá that the ladies with whom the appointment has been made are awaiting his pleasure?" Very soon after that, the ladies were delighted to hear the footsteps of Abdu'l Bahá as he accompanied the bore to the door of the flat. Then Abdu'l Bahá came in. He stopped at the door and looked at them gravely. "You were making that poor man uncomfortable," he said, "so strongly desiring his absence. I took him away to make him happy." When she wrote about it, Lady Blomfield commented, "Truly, Abdu'l Bahá's thoughts and ways were very far removed from ours." The eventual arrival of Haji Abdul Hassani Adikani, we know him better, I think, as Haji Amin. His arrival from Paris amused Abdu'l Bahá a lot, because the Haji didn't speak English or French, or for that matter, any other European language. And he somehow got himself back to Paris after crossing the Channel. He had had names and addresses written out for him to show to officials and conductors to help him on his journey. But when at last Haji Amin arrived in London, Abdu'l Bahá laughingly told him that no doubt he could not forsake the delights of Paris and had had to hurry back. Suffragettes, Mrs. Pankhurst, visited Abdu'l Bahá and referred to him as a prophet. The master said, with a broad smile, "Oh, no, I am a man like you." A number of other suffragettes who called on him on another occasion were strongly advised to leave off the violence and to observe moderation. That was the master's counsel at all times. When Abdu'l Bahá sat down to dinner on Christmas Eve, he said playfully that he was not hungry, but he had to come to the dinner table because Lady Blomfield was very insistent. Two despotic monarchs of the East had not been able to command him and bend his will. But the ladies of America and Europe, because they were free, gave him orders. On Christmas Day itself, the same stream of people visited Abdu'l Bahá. Later in the day, he himself visited Lord Lamington, who had at one time been governor of the Bombay Presidency in India. That was a very important visit, and we shall hear about Lord Lamington later. And one day the master walked for an hour or so in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, and he stood on the bridge that spans the Serpentine. And when we lived in the Hazrat Goods in London for 9 years and often went there because it was our place to get some air, we always remembered Abdu'l Bahá when we stood on that bridge. And I think most of the friends do too. On January 6th, Abdu'l Bahá travelled by train to Edinburgh to stay as the guest of Dr. and Mrs. Alexander White. You remember that Mrs. White visited Abdu'l Bahá in Acre with her friend Mrs. Thornborough Cropper, and the 7 Candles of Unity is included in the tablet the master wrote for Mrs. White. Dr. White was a prominent minister of the United Free Church of Scotland. The manse at 7 Charlotte Square, one of Edinburgh's most beautiful squares, was attached to St. George's United Free Church. Now it is the property of the National Trust for Scotland, and so it is cared for by them. I think actually it's the manse, the official residence of the moderator of the Church of Scotland at this time. On January the 10th, after a most successful and busy visit in Scotland, the master returned to London. And in January 1957, Shaghi Effendi said to a pilgrim that Abdu'l Bahá loved England so much he visited it 3 times. It took me quite a long time to work that out, but then I realized that Abdu'l Bahá had returned to England from Scotland. Do you think that is significant for Scotland's destiny in the future? It is not possible to cover the whole of Abdu'l Bahá's 39 days in Britain, because we must press on. On January 21st, 1913, the master left for Paris. He had only a few public engagements in Paris, but met many emigrants from Iran and the Ottoman Empire, who sought him and requested to meet him. And he received them all impartially, no matter what their political aims or views were. Iranian students, members of the Persian nobility, all came to him. And the Baha'i community of Paris had fewer French than it had Americans, English, and Persians. Abdu'l Bahá's health was not good in Paris, and that delayed his departure for Germany. But on March the 30th, he left by train for Stuttgart. He had told his attendants to change completely from Oriental dress to European dress and to discard their Oriental headgear. He reached Stuttgart on the evening of April 1st. There are many wonderful memories in Germany of Abdu'l Bahá's visit there. But one thing that will surely not be forgotten is the children's feast held in Esslingen. And Alma Knobloch, whose name you probably know, wrote to her sister in America about that feast. She said, "We have had some wonderful meetings. The one in Esslingen surpassed them all. It was the children's meeting last Friday, April 4th, 1913, in the afternoon. They had secured a very pretty hall, which was most beautifully decorated with greens, plants, and flowers, with large and small tables near the walls and round tables in the center. About 50 children and 80 adults were present. In a smaller room adjoining the hall, the children had assembled, holding in their hands flowers and forming 2 lines for Abdu'l Bahá to pass through. It looked most beautiful as Abdu'l Bahá came upstairs. He passed through a short hall and looked so pleased and delighted to see the dear children. And the children presented their flowers to Abdu'l Bahá, and he gave them boxes of chocolates and sweets. And later he spoke to them all, children and adults, young and old, and a photograph was taken outside the hall. Abdu'l Bahá was seated in the middle. And the following day, at his hotel, he spoke with great joy of the previous day's gathering in Esslingen. And when you visit Esslingen, enthusiastic Baha'is, who are now grandparents, will take out their copy of that photograph, which is not small, they all had enlargements, and proudly point to themselves there as little children. Abdu'l Bahá left for Budapest at 8 in the evening of April 8th. Next morning, he had to change trains at Vienna, and also he had to change stations. So the Iranian Baha'is who met him had some few minutes with him. There were no Baha'is in the Hungarian capital before Abdu'l Bahá's coming, because no one had taught the faith there. And Mr. and Mrs. Stark and a few others who had invited Abdu'l Bahá to their city had mistakenly gone to the wrong station to meet him. But they knew that he would be staying at the Hotel Ritz, so they all went over there. Newspaper reporters arrived. Well-known academics, as well as Arabs and Turks, called on him. He gave public addresses to large audiences, and he sat for his portrait to be painted at the studio of Professor Nadler, a well-known portrait painter. The weather in Budapest was particularly bad, with blizzard conditions and frequent snowfalls. Abdu'l Bahá had planned to leave for Vienna on April 14th, but stayed one more day to address another meeting and caught a severe cold. He could not leave until April 19th. The master reached Vienna on the evening of April 19th, and the Theosophists in Vienna were particularly interested in his visit, and he addressed the members of that Theosophical Society 3 times. In the afternoon of April the 20th, he was the guest, first of the Persian minister, then of the Turkish ambassador. On April 21st, the Persian minister called in the morning. Some Iranian residents in Vienna visited him on the 23rd, and on the 24th, he returned to Stuttgart. During this second visit to Stuttgart, the master was mostly unwell. The cold he had caught in Budapest affected his chest, but he did address one meeting, so as not to disappoint the Baha'is, and he was particularly glad when a number of children were brought to the hotel on April 27th. On the morning of May 1st, he met the Baha'is in Stuttgart in several groups. Then he left for Paris. He had been in Stuttgart a week. This was the Master's third visit to Paris. He was still unwell, and on several occasions could not attend the meetings in the homes of the friends. But he was always receiving visitors at the hotel, giving a talk whenever they gathered in numbers. One day in Paris, he spoke of the covenant, that his purpose was to safeguard the strength and power of the cause, and that without it, the circle of Baha'is would have been broken up completely. Some Iranian notables visited Abdu'l Bahá, and they invited him for a motor car ride one afternoon, and they took him to the racecourse. But Abdu'l Bahá returned very soon. He preferred walking to riding in motor cars, and he went for a long walk with Dr. Muhammad Khan, one of the Iranian Baha'is then in Paris. On May 27th, Abdu'l Bahá changed his hotel so that he could have a few days' rest before people found him and came to him again. The visits and gatherings continued to the end of his stay in Paris. It was on June 12th at 8 a.m. that he left the hotel for the railway station. There he spoke with the Baha'is who had come to say farewell and told them to be united at all times. His train left at noon, and it reached Marseille 12 hours later. He stayed the rest of the night at the hotel next to the railway station, and at 9 o'clock the next morning boarded the P&O steamer Himalaya for Port Said. He landed there on June 17th, 1913. And the Master remained in Egypt almost 6 months, spending much of the time again at Ramleh in the suburbs of Alexandria. Shoghi Effendi, the greatest holy leaf, and Abdu'l Bahá's eldest daughter, Shoghi Effendi's mother, joined him there from Haifa on August the 1st. And a Bahá'í going to Abdu'l Bahá's house early one morning heard Shoghi Effendi chanting a prayer and heard Abdu'l Bahá instructing him. Shoghi Effendi at that time was 17 years old. Abdu'l Bahá's health had first improved in Egypt. Then again, it became worse. He was much distressed by attempts that were being made to divide the Baha'is in Iran, and also by Dr. Farid's behavior. Dr. Farid later became a covenant breaker. The Master went for a few days to Abu Qir, but the change of scenery brought no relief, and his family were begging him to return to the Holy Land. So he decided to leave Egypt. On December the 2nd, he boarded a ship for Haifa. It stopped twice at Port Said and Jaffa, and the Baha'is of those places were able to be with him for a short while. On December 5th, 1913, the boat cast anchor in the harbor of Haifa. Abdu'l Bahá was home. He was 69 years old. He had been away 3 years and 3 months, and he never left the Holy Land again. When we look at the situation at that time, we find that the Middle East once more was in some turmoil, and the situation in the Balkans was getting out of hand. Abdu'l Bahá had not been back in the Holy Land a year before the war he had tried so hard to prevent broke out in Europe. It soon spread across the European continent and beyond. The different nations grouped together, and the Middle East became one of the centers of this world war. and then the situation in the Balkans got completely out of hand. In the first week of November 1914, Russia, Great Britain, and France declared war on Turkey. Turkey's Ottoman government responded on November the 14th by declaring jihad, holy war, hoping to bring all the Muslim countries in the world, including India, into the conflict on its side. Although that didn't happen, the terrible horrors of war spread. The British took over Egypt. Then, early in 1915, the Turkish Fourth Army Corps, commanded by Jamal Pasha, moved to try to overrun the Suez Canal and drive the British out. The whole of Syria, including the Holy Land, was under the military control of that commander. Spies were everywhere. Fear spread through the population like an epidemic. But Mr. Belluzzi has reported on the position, and from his book we find something very interesting indeed about Abdu'l Bahā's contact with Jamal Pasha. Because when the commander encamped in the vicinity of Akka, that was in 1915, he told the governor that he must see Abdu'l Bahā at once. Riding his donkey, Abdu'l Bahā went to the military cantonment. Jamal Pasha received him courteously, but told him that he was a religious mischief maker, which was the reason he had been put under restraint in the past. It happened that in the days of Abdul Hamid, Jamal Pasha himself had been known as a political mischief maker. So Abdu'l Bahā now replied that mischief making was of two kinds, political and religious. And then, pointing at the arrogant Pasha, he said that so far the political mischief maker had not caused any damage. It was to be hoped that the religious mischief maker would not do so either. But Lady Blomfield, who really was a very wonderful woman, recorded another encounter between Abdu'l Bahā and Jamal Pasha. The story was related by Mirza Jalal, a son-in-law of Abdu'l Bahā, and here it is. At the beginning of the year 1916, at about 7 o'clock in the morning, Abdu'l Bahā sent me for his faithful coachman. Tell Effendi to have my carriage brought, and you and Khosrow be ready to accompany me to Nazareth in half an hour. We did as he commanded, and at the appointed time, Abdu'l Bahā left his home in Haifa, accompanied by Khosrow and me. That day, the health of Abdu'l Bahā was not very satisfactory, as one could see by the signs of weariness on his blessed face. However, the commander-in-chief of the Syrian and Palestine fronts was in Nazareth. He was Jamal Pasha, and Abdu'l Bahā was determined to meet him there. So in spite of his great fatigue and physical weakness, the beloved started on his journey. Abdu'l Bahā arrived at Nazareth in the evening at 7 o'clock and took up his residence at the German hotel. The next day, the master was invited to lunch at the home of one of the notables of the town of Nazareth. On that day, Jamal Pasha and nearly 200 of the war leaders were present at the lunch, where the master sat down at 1 o'clock and arose from the table at 4. During all those hours, Abdu'l Bahā was speaking in Turkish on philosophical and scientific subjects and on heavenly teachings. So intense was his utterance that all stopped eating while they listened to his blessed words. Jamal Pasha, who had been his great enemy because of false accusations, had not paid the proper respect to Abdu'l Bahā when he first arrived. Now, however, having heard the master speak so learnedly and wisely, he was most deferential and full of all kinds of politeness. When the time came for the master to rise, Jamal Pasha most courteously held the beloved's arm to assist him to leave the table, and himself led the way to the reception room. And after answering more questions and giving wondrous light on many subjects, the master arose to bid farewell to his host. Jamal Pasha accompanied him out of the house and to the bottom of the steps, and would have gone further, but the master thanked him with great kindness and was urged by Abdu'l Bahá to return. This was that Jamal Pasha who was not accustomed to rise from his seat, to pay respect to anyone. Abdu'l Bahá was excessively fatigued and remained that night at the German hotel in Nazareth. But Jamal Pasha was again fed rumors and untruths by the enemies of Abdu'l Bahá. In 1916, later, he stated that he would crucify Abdu'l Bahá when he returned victorious from his campaign. But when Jamal Pasha did come back, he was in full flight, defeated and humiliated, and he could not stop to carry out his threat. By August 1915, Iran, although she had declared herself to be neutral, was brought into the war. The Iranian people themselves took part, most of them favoring Turkey and Germany. German and Turkish, Russian and British agents were everywhere. Russia and Turkey fought each other in the north and in the northwest of Iran. The British occupied the port of Bushehr in August 1915 and landed a small force at Bandar Abbas in March 1916. It pressed on inland to Kerman, Yazd, and Isfahan, and reached Shiraz in November. Bandits and highwaymen, as long as they didn't get in the way of the armies, had the freedom of the roads and the caravan routes. All was chaos. And the Baha'is had their own share of the troubles. A well-known merchant was martyred in Narak-Nekashan, and in Sultanabad a family of 7 were killed in their home in the dead of night. At the same time, the British Indian Army was pushing forward in Mesopotamia, and despite a grave setback in April 1916, it recovered and went on to capture Baghdad in March 1917. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, mismanagement by the Ottoman authorities added to the devastation caused by locusts and brought about a food shortage which added to the problems of war. Abdu'l Bahá arose to help to relieve that particular suffering. There were Baha'i properties in the Jordan Valley and beyond, and by the shores of the Sea of Galilee, this Lake Tiberias, that could be cultivated for food. Some of those lands were part of the endowments of the shrines of Baha'u'llah and the Bab. Abdu'l Bahá set about organizing the growing and later, in the intense heat of midsummer, the harvesting of wheat. He then arranged its transport by camel and its distribution in Haifa and Akka. Later, when the British Army, under General Allenby, outran its supply lines, having pushed on to Haifa quick as possible, Abdu'l Bahá also made corn available for the army. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The Holy Land had been getting more and more isolated. Now its isolation was almost complete. Writing about Abdu'l Bahá at that time, Shoghi Effendi said, "Agony filled his soul at the spectacle of human slaughter precipitated through humanity's failure to respond to the summons he had issued, or to heed the warnings he had given. Surely sorrow upon sorrow was added to the burden of trials and vicissitudes which he, since his boyhood, had borne so heroically for the sake and in the service of his father's cause." In the years 1916 and 1917, when the planet was tortured by the horrors of the First World War, the Middle East was suffering and completely disrupted, and his own life was in great danger, Abdu'l Bahá's thoughts were not dwelling on the past. He was already looking to the future. His thoughts were reaching out to our own time and beyond. It was between Nowruz and Rizwan 1916 and early February and March 1917 that he revealed the tablets of the divine plan. There are 14 individual tablets, but together they form a single great teaching charter. This charter sets the direction for all the teaching plans in the Baha'i world. It is not only the source of their inspiration, it is the very springboard from which each of the international teaching plans has been, is now, and will be launched in the future. The tablets are all addressed to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. They are the custodians of the tablets of the divine plan, a great privilege given by Abdu'l Bahá to the Baha'is in the New World of the West. 4 of them are addressed generally to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. 2 are to the 9 northeastern states, 2 to the 16 southern states, 2 to the 12 central states, 2 to the 11 western states, and 2 to the Baha'is of Canada. They mention by name some 120 territories and islands throughout the world. Some of the names, in the meanwhile, have changed. The Gilbert Islands in the Pacific, for example, have become the Caribbean Republic, and the Ellis part of that island group in the Pacific is now the Republic of Tuvalu. But what the tablets of the divine plan put before us is a charter to draw all the peoples of the world into the Christ-promised kingdom of God on earth. The 8 tablets revealed in 1916 were dictated by Abdu'l Bahá at Baji, some in the garden outside the shrine of Baha'u'llah, and some in Abdu'l Bahá's room in the house in Baji, not the mansion, the house close by. Of the 6 revealed in 1917, some were dictated in Abdu'l Bahá's house in Haifa, and some in Baha'u'llah's room at the house of Abud in Akka. Each of them is a treasury of wisdom, knowledge, practical guidance, and sometimes prophecy. Here are some extracts from those tablets. From the tablets to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada, April 8, 1916, the first of these 4 tablets. Similarly, the 6 Central American republics situated south of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, and the 7th country of Belize, or British Honduras. The teachers going to those parts must also be familiar with the Spanish language. April 11th, 1916, the second of those tablets. It is said that in South Africa a diamond mine is discovered. Although this mine is most valuable, yet, after all, it is stone. Perchance, God willing, the mine of humanity may be discovered, and the brilliant pearls of the kingdom found. April 19th, 20th, and 22nd, 1917, the third of these tablets. Here Abdu'l Bahá sets out the conditions for success. The first condition is firmness in the covenant of God. The second condition, fellowship and love amongst the believers. The third condition, teachers must continually travel to all parts of the continent, nay, rather, to all parts of the world. But they must travel like Abdu'l Bahá, who journeyed through the cities of America. He was sanctified and free from every attachment and in the utmost severance. Just as His Holiness Christ says, "Shake off the very dust from your feet." Those were all extracts from the tablets to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. April 5th, 1916, from the first tablet to the Baha'is of Canada. Should in Greenland the fire of the love of God be ignited, all the ices of that continent will be melted, and its frigid climate will be changed into a temperate climate. That is, if the hearts will obtain the heat of the love of God, that country and continent will become a divine garden and a lovely orchard, and the souls, like unto the fruitful trees, will obtain the utmost freshness and delicacy. Should you display an effort so that the fragrances of God be diffused amongst the Eskimos, its effect will be very great and far-reaching. Now I tell you a little story from Bill Carr, who was a pioneer from Canada, who went up to Tula in Greenland. There's an American base Met station up there, or at least there used to be. And Bill Carr was there for quite a long time, in the course of which I met him once, and 15 years later I met him again, and he told me exactly the same story both times. Bill made the pilgrimage to the Holy Land during the lifetime of Shoghi Effendi. And knowing of this prophecy in the tablets of the Divine Plan, he asked Shoghi Effendi, about the prophecy about Greenland, does it mean the physical ice of Greenland will melt, or does it mean the ice in the hearts of the Eskimo will melt? Bill told me that the Guardian said, both. And Bill said, but how many Eskimo have to become Baha'i before that happens? And Shoghi Effendi replied, not too many. Well, you see, in our last teaching plan, and also in this plan, one of the tasks of the Baha'i community of Denmark is to develop the Baha'i faith in Greenland with a view to establishing a national spiritual assembly there. So they have been working very steadily and with the greatest joy with teaching the Eskimo the faith of Baha'u'llah in Greenland. And even when I had the privilege to work with Denmark, 2 local spiritual assemblies had already been formed there, and 2 more were being worked upon. And you know what the Baha'is of Denmark used to say to me? Betty, this is entirely an act of faith, because if the ice melts in Greenland, one of the first countries to be entirely flooded will be Denmark. As some of you know, Denmark is not a country. It's a lot of very important islands linked together by sea. We call it the duck ponds over which the ships sail, yes? And Denmark is almost entirely flat. It's quite like Holland in that respect. So what we can expect, we don't know. But the Baha'is of Denmark are pressing on in good faith. Most of the tablets of the Divine Plan end with a supplication, and many of these wonderful prayers are well known. And now we're going to look at what has been called the unveiling of the tablets of the divine plan. And this means exactly what it says. During the war, the tablets were kept for a while in the vaults of the tomb of the Bab on Mount Carmel. Translations of the first 5 were sent to the United States in 1916 and published in the magazine Star of the West. On September 8, 1916, volume 7, you will find those tablets. But Abdu'l Bahá had them all taken to America for the convention of 1919. His secretary, Ahmad Sorab, was entrusted with that task, and he left the Holy Land on December 23, 1918, for the United States. He finished translating the tablets in the United States in Washington. And the tablets were presented to the American Baha'is at the annual convention in 1919 of the Temple Foundation Unity. There was no National Spiritual Assembly anywhere at that time. The convention was held at the Hotel McAlpin in New York City, and a special cable came from Abdu'l Bahá naming it the Convention of the Covenant. Session by session, in that convention, the tablets of the divine plan were unveiled. Here is an account of the first occasion, when the tablets to the northeastern states were unveiled. And it says, Margaret P. Randall and Bertha Holly drew aside the curtains, showing the tablet in Persian beautifully embossed and framed. Beneath the tablet was seen a colored map of the northeastern states, the section addressed in the master's tablet. Soulful and sweet music of the harp accompanied the unveiling. Translations of the tablets were read, and the supplications chanted as the sessions of the convention proceeded. But now we must go back to those years in the Holy Land towards the end of the 1914-18 war. And the most effective way to do this is to turn to documents quoted by Mr. Baluzzi. So we look now for page 425, and here it is. On December 9th, 1917, General Allenby entered Jerusalem. It now seemed certain that the days of the Ottoman rule in the Holy Land were numbered. But the life of Abdu'l Bahá was still in danger. And here is what Lady Blomfield wrote. In the spring of 1918, I was much startled and deeply disturbed by a telephone message. Abdu'l Bahá in serious danger. Take immediate action. It came from an authoritative source. There was not a moment to be lost. Every available power must be brought to bear to save the Master. I went at once to Lord Lamington. Remember, the Master had called on Lord Lamington on Christmas Day of the last visit he made to London. I went at once to Lord Lamington. His sympathetic regard for Abdu'l Bahá, his understanding of the ramifications and red tape necessary for immediate action were of priceless value. A letter was immediately written to the Foreign Office explaining the importance of Abdu'l Bahā's position, his work for true peace, and for the spiritual welfare of many thousands of people. Through the influence of Lord Lamington and his prompt help, the letter, with its alarming news, was at once put into the hands of Lord Balfour. Arthur Balfour at that time was the Foreign Secretary. That very evening, a cable was sent to General Allenby with these instructions, quote, extend every protection and consideration to Abdu'l Bahá, his family, and his friends when the British march on Haifa. So a terrible tragedy was averted by the promptness and understanding of Lord Lamington and the power of Lord Balfour, his colleagues in the cabinet here in London, and by the devotion, efficiency and promptitude of Major Tudor Pole at the Turkish end, for Haifa was still in the hands of the Turks. You remember Wellesley Tudor Pole? The Turks had been so aroused by the enemies of the Master that they had threatened to crucify him and all his family on Mount Carmel. When General Allenby took Haifa, several days before it was believed possible for him to do so, he sent a cablegram to London, which caused everyone to wonder, and especially filled the hearts of the Baha'is in all the world with deep gratitude to the Almighty Protector. The cable of General Allenby was as follows, quote, "Have today taken Palestine. Notify the world that Abdu'l Bahá is safe." Major Tudor Pole himself wrote about that time. He said, "It must have been the early spring of 1918 that I began to feel acute anxiety for Abdu'l Bahá's safety at Haifa and that of his family and followers there. I came out of the line in December 1917 during the attack on Jerusalem, and being temporarily incapacitated for active service, was transferred to intelligence, first at Cairo and later at Lud, Jaffa and Jerusalem. With an advanced base at and around Jaffa, we were beginning to prepare for a move towards Haifa and the north at that time. For several reasons, including the shortage of men and munitions, the British advance was delayed well into the summer of 1918. Meanwhile, the news reached me concerning Abdu'l Bahá's imminent danger. It became more and more alarming. I tried to arouse interest in the matter amongst those who were responsible for intelligence service activities. I also brought the matter before my own chief, General Sir Arthur Money, Chief Administrator of Occupied Enemy Territory. At this time, chance brought me into touch with an officer whose social and political connections in London were strong. Through his courtesy and interest, I was enabled to get an urgent message through to the British Foreign Office. Through friends associated with the Baha'i cause in England, an independent avenue of approach to the ruling powers in London was discovered. By these means, Lord Balfour, Lord Curzon, and others in the cabinet were advised as to the critical situation at Haifa. Lord Lamington's influence proved a special help at this time. The upshot of these various activities bore fruit, and the Foreign Office sent a dispatch to General Allenby instructing him to ensure the safety of Abdu'l Bahá and his family and entourage so soon as the British Army captured Haifa. This dispatch passed through my hands in Cairo en route for Army headquarters at Lud, and intelligence was requested to make urgent inquiry. In due course, this demand for information reached the headquarters of intelligence at the Savoy Hotel, Cairo, and ultimately, when inquiries elsewhere had proved fruitless, was passed to me for action. As a result, General Allenby was provided with full particulars in regard to Abdu'l Bahá and the history of the movement of which he was the master. Allenby at once issued orders to the general commanding officer in command of the Haifa operations to the effect that immediately the town was entered, a British guard was to be posted at once around Abdu'l Bahá's house, and a further guard was to be placed at the disposal of his family and followers. Means were found for making it known within the enemy lines that stern retribution would follow any attempt to cause death or injury to the great Persian master or to any of his household. When Haifa was ultimately taken, these instructions for posting a guard were duly carried out, and all dangers of death or accident were thereby averted. It was a wonderful experience in the midst of the chaos of war conditions to visit the Master at his Mount Carmel home, which even at that time was a haven of peace and refreshment. I can remember him, majestic yet gentle, pacing up and down his garden, whilst he spoke to me about eternal realities, at a time when the whole material world was rocking on its foundations. The divine power of the Spirit shone through his presence, giving one the feeling that a great prophet from Old Testament days had risen up in a war-stricken world as an inspirer and spiritual guide for the human race. One or two incidents which happened shortly afterwards, connected with the capture of Haifa, are worthy of record. During the British advance from the south, field batterers were placed in position on high ground immediately to the southeast of Mount Carmel, the intention being to shell Haifa at long range over Mount Carmel itself. Some of the eastern Baha'is living on the northern slopes of Mount Carmel became agitated, went to Abdu'l Bahá's residence, and expressed fear as to the tragic course of possible events. According to an eyewitness of this scene, from whom I obtained the story when I reached Haifa, Abdu'l Bahá calmed his excited followers and called them to prayer. Then he told them that all would be well, and that no British shells would cause death or damage to the population or to Haifa and its environs. As a matter of historical fact, the range of the field batteries in question was inaccurate, the shells passing harmlessly over the town and falling into Bay of Acre beyond. Another incident of those stirring times is worthy of record, although I am not able to vouch for its complete accuracy at first hand. Before the fall of Haifa, Abdu'l Bahá was discussing the British campaign with a few of his followers in his garden one day. He then predicted that, contrary to the general expectations, the taking of Haifa and the walled town of Acre would come about almost without bloodshed. This prediction was verified by facts. He also stated that the Turks would surrender Acre, supposed to be impregnable, to 2 unarmed British soldiers. The resultant facts, so far as I was able to gather them, were as follows. Subsequent to the entry of our troops into Haifa, the front line was pushed forward halfway across the Bay of Acre, and outposts were placed in position on the sands of the bay, some 4 miles from Acre itself. Acre, as a fortified and walled town, was believed to be filled with Turkish troops at this time. Very early one morning, 2 British Army service soldiers, who had lost their bearings in the night, found themselves at the gates of Acre, believing erroneously that the town was already in British hands. However, the Turkish rearguard troops had been secretly evacuated only 8 hours earlier, and the mayor of the town, seeing British soldiers outside the gates, came down and presented them with the keys of the town in token of surrender. It is credibly stated that the dismayed Thomas, being unarmed, dropped the keys and made post-haste for the British lines. There is just one more smallish piece that will complete this story. On September 23rd, British forces coming along a coastal road rounded the promontory of Mount Carmel and appeared before Haifa. The mayor and the notables went out to offer their submission. The first question that the British commanding officer put to the mayor of Haifa was, "Is Abdu'l Bahá in this city? Is he safe?" Abdu'l Bahá was sitting, calm and unperturbed, in the forecourt of his house. Baha'is were there around him, tense and awaiting news. Indian army outriders arrived post-haste at the gates of the house. The next evening, the governor of Jerusalem came in person to pay his respects. Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Storrs was not a stranger. He had known Abdu'l Bahá as far back as the days of the master's incarceration within the city walls of Akka. He came again the following morning, September 25th, before returning to Jerusalem. I have always felt that in the future, the Baha'is of India will be proud of the part the Indian army played as it moved up post-haste to take Akka and save the life of Abdu'l Bahá. We have almost finished. On Tuesday, April 27th, 1920, in the afternoon session of the American Convention, the design for the Mashriq al-Ashkar, the foundation stone of which Abdu'l Bahá had himself laid on May 1st, 1912, was finally chosen by the 49 delegates present. On that same day, in Haifa, in the garden of the military governor of Haifa, Abdu'l Bahá was invested with the insignia of the knighthood of the British Empire. In recognition of his humanitarian work during the war for the relief of distress and famine, he accepted the honor as the gift of a just king, but never used the title. Mr. Bagliuzzi again quotes Lady Blomfield in a very short passage. Lady Blomfield writes, "The dignitaries of the British Crown from Jerusalem were gathered in Haifa, eager to do honor to the Master, whom everyone had come to love and reverence for his life of unselfish service. An imposing motor car had been sent to bring Abdu'l Bahá to the ceremony. The Master, however, could not be found. People were sent in every direction to look for him, when suddenly, from an unexpected side, he appeared, alone, walking his kingly walk, with that simplicity of greatness which always enfolded him. The faithful servant, Effendi, whose joy it had been for many years to drive the Master on errands of mercy, stood sadly looking on at the elegant motor car which awaited the honored guest. No longer am I needed. But at a sign from Abdu'l Bahá, who knew the sorrow, old Effendi rushed off to harness the horse and brought the carriage to the lower gate, whence Abdu'l Bahá was driven to a side entrance of the garden of the government of Phoenicia. So Effendi was needed, and he was happy."